Ring-a-ling-a-ling, y'all. It's Sabbath School time, and I'm here to help teachers and front row students think creatively and critically so you can get the most out of your class. Now, this quarter we're studying Daniel, and today we're covering the lesson for January the 25th, 2020, From Furnace to Palace, though it should probably be called From Palace to Furnace to Palace. But anyways, let's go. So Nebuchadnezzar has made a huge golden statue, and the lesson asks us to imagine why Nebuchadnezzar would build this statue. So how do we answer that question, since we don't know what the statue looks like? I mean, every single painting of this statue depicts it as a kind of golden image of Nebuchadnezzar himself, because that's how early Christians described it. But the Bible never tells us what the image looked like. It could have been a horse. Okay, it probably was human-ish. But how do we know that? Well, since the object was for worship, it seems likely it was one of Babylon's gods, like Nebo. Also, the 10-to-1 ratio used to build this thing suggests something proportionally human. Finally, we get to the point the lesson wants us to reach, and that is that it's probably connected to the statue Nebuchadnezzar saw in Daniel 2. But make no mistake, a 90-foot-high statue would have been gigantic, about as tall as the Colossus of Rhodes or the Lighthouse of Alexandria, two of the ancient wonders of the world. It's almost unbelievable that Nebuchadnezzar would have wasted so much gold to construct something so massive. But just stop for a moment and admire the sheer scale of this project. Now, the theological meaning of the thing is not hard to miss. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold in chapter 2, and Daniel wants us to interpret this statue as Nebuchadnezzar basically thumbing his nose at God and saying, "No, my kingdom will endure forever." And with that said, let's try to keep in mind all that we do not know. The Greek translation of the Old Testament includes a note that Daniel 3 took place 16 years after Daniel chapter 2. So was Nebuchadnezzar still thinking of his dream in chapter 2 if this thing happened 16 years later? Okay, we don't know the context of Daniel 3 historically. Why is everyone gathered on the plain of Dura to worship this statue? What happened that convinced Nebuchadnezzar to basically build the eighth wonder of the ancient world? Okay, most idols were just a few inches tall. Why not build one of those out of gold and force people to bow down to it? Why is this worship of this statue so incredibly urgent to Nebuchadnezzar? These questions are just so tantalizing. What I'm saying is, yes, there's a clear thematic connection to Daniel 2. Yes, Nebuchadnezzar is arrogant. Yes, he is defying the God of heaven. But there's also more going on here, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. Nebuchadnezzar isn't doing this simply to thumb his nose at God. The Chronicles of the Chaldean Kings notes, for instance, that Nebuchadnezzar faced a revolt in Syria in his 10th year, probably from one of his soldiers. We know Nebuchadnezzar was murderously suspicious about rivals. He suspected the wise men in chapter 2, and now he is faced with this rebellion by one of his soldiers. So he builds a statue and gathers the leaders of his administration to bow down before it. It wasn't as much about worship as it was about making an oath of loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar himself, about preserving his rule. As the teacher's notes on this lesson say, in the ancient world, religion and politics were tightly intertwined, so patriotism was expressed by means of adoration of the national gods. Hey, little has changed there, but this placed Daniel's three friends in an impossible situation because they were loyal to Babylon, but not to Babylon's gods. And there was just no way to demonstrate that distinction back then. It was all or nothing. And this may explain why, if this was a loyalty test, Nebuchadnezzar may not have seen it as thumbing his nose at Israel's God. To him, this little civil religion was more about loyalty than it was about worship. Worship was just a means to an end. So how do we know this? Because in verse 12, the Chaldeans complain that the three Hebrews have not shown proper respect to you, O king. The question at the bottom of Sunday is good, too. It's worth reflecting on where pride leads us. How far are we willing to go to protect our images, our privileges, our power? Monday is kind of like a commercial break as we pause the historical narrative and talk about the broader theme of worship, because we usually imagine this event taking place on this huge stretch of land, but D'Souza, our author, notes that the word dura just means walled place, and that the furnace gives the impression of an altar where burnt offerings are made. In other words, The imagery here of this place is that they're in a makeshift outdoor temple with a worship band and everything. I wonder if they wore skinny jeans. Anyways, speaking of the worship band, what's interesting is that according to Stefanovich's commentary on Daniel, none of these instruments were ever used by the Israelites. 3 of the instruments mentioned are Greek. And I've seen Adventists make a big deal about these instruments and connecting them to modern instruments used in worship, and just don't. D'Souza also wants us to explore the parallels between Daniel 3 and Revelation 13, where a beast forces the world to worship or die. And this is definitely a new apocalyptic theme in the Bible. For instance, we don't see Pharaoh making the Israelites worship his gods or else. We don't see the Moabites doing it. This is something kind of new. And when the herald in Daniel 3 verse 4 calls out, he speaks to the nations, peoples, and men of every language. This is language we see in Revelation. So there are definitely apocalyptic connections here. And what I love about the idea of worship is what it says about human beings. That is, that you have something to give. God wants your worship, but other people and beings in the cosmos want your worship as well. Satan wants your worship. The beasts want your worship. Your worship is in high demand. So the question is then, who are you giving it to, right? Finally, let's get on to Tuesday. We return to our story. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah stand tall while everyone else is bowing. Naturally, some of the Chaldeans tattletale on the 3 Hebrews. It seems that nobody has learned their lesson from chapter 2. These Hebrews helped save some of those Chaldeans' lives. Are they resentful that Daniel and his friends were promoted? These 2 goody two-shoe foreigners came in and took our jobs, that kind of thing. The Babylonian court was cutthroat. Ashpenaz doesn't let Daniel do his diet, so Daniel goes under Ashpenaz and asks the guy Ashpenaz had put in charge. Chapter 2, Daniel goes to Arioch, and Arioch steals credit from Daniel to curry favor with the king. In chapter 3, the Hebrews' own colleagues turn them in. And of course, we all know what happens in Persia with the lion's den. There are no safe zones in this work environment, okay? You cannot go to HR for any reason whatsoever. So the Chaldeans go to King Nebi, and they twist the situation. They know that Nebuchadnezzar himself had set them up to rule over the province of Babylon, and that these Jews have not shown proper gratitude or respect to the king. These Chaldeans are grooming the king, in the way that they phrase this. They're basically saying, remember that you gave them their jobs and they aren't being grateful to you in return. And oh, by the way, remember that they're in charge of the whole province of Babylon. That's not where you want your traitors to be. Okay, you don't want them to have access to the palace. Now, the Chaldeans put their king in a dilemma. Nebuchadnezzar probably wasn't expecting anyone to be dumb enough to stay standing during this. And if he doesn't make good on his threats, he's going to appear weak in front of all the leaders of Babylon. And the whole point of this exercise is to appear strong, not weak. So Nebuchadnezzar has no choice but to kill them. Kingdom over conscience, my friends. It probably doesn't help that the Jewish king back home at this time is plotting to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar right about now. In fact, he may be present at this ceremony. Now, we all know how this goes. Nebuchadnezzar is consumed by rage. Nebuchadnezzar is the furnace. And once again, you can see through this phony worship service. Nebuchadnezzar asks, "Is it true that you do not serve my gods or bow before the image of gold I have set up? If you don't, then what God can save you from my hand?" It's all about Nebuchadnezzar. And that last line is a bit of blasphemy. Is Nebuchadnezzar stronger than the gods? If the accusation was that the Hebrews do not show respect to Nebuchadnezzar, then how do the Chaldeans explain the very polite, deferential way that the Hebrews are responding to Nebuchadnezzar? The Hebrews display such a mature, calm faith, right? God can save us, but even if he chooses not to, that's okay. It reminds you of that line in Job, "Though he kills me, yet will I trust him." Nebuchadnezzar says, "Okay, well, let's find out," and throws them in. Now, we're told that they went into the fiery furnace wearing turbans and robes. Clothes were expensive in the ancient world, okay? You didn't waste good clothes for nothing. But such was Nebuchadnezzar's anger that he didn't care. A rabbi in the Talmud noticed this detail and said, even during a period of danger, a person should not deviate from his prominence, which is to say, go out with dignity, right? Wear your fancy hat and your robes, befitting your office and station in life, and go out with dignity. Of course, the king's anger backfires, and 2 of Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers die as they throw the Hebrews in. On Wednesday, we discover that Daniel's friends survived the fire just fine. Surprise! I like to picture Ashpenaz roasting a marshmallow while in there. Nebuchadnezzar is shocked and jumps to his feet when he sees a fourth person in the fire. And I know Nebuchadnezzar is like basically Babylonian Hitler, but he's a really great character in this book, and he does everything with the utmost enthusiasm, right? He jumps to his feet. He routinely threatens to kill everyone. Nebuchadnezzar does not chill. They did not have Netflix back then. Anyways, where was Daniel during all of this? Okay, we don't know. The rabbis had some ideas. One rabbi said Daniel was in Egypt getting some pigs to bring back to Babylon. Another asks that first rabbi, but I thought the Egyptians sterilized their animals, which they sold to other nations, so that they couldn't breed them. Oh, said the first rabbi, well, these were young pigs Daniel got, and he snuck them out of the country without customs being aware of it. And it's like, what? So yeah, your guess is as good as theirs as to where Daniel is. Anyways, the fourth person in the furnace, okay? Nebuchadnezzar describes this person as like a son of the gods. And obviously Christians see this as a reference to Jesus or maybe some angel. And so the circle is now complete, right? Nebuchadnezzar, who built an idol of a god, now comes face to face with a god. And it's a beautiful lesson because Nebuchadnezzar thought that God was with the majority, but in the end, this God was with the minority, with the conscientious objectors. And this God was in the fire with his people. Isaiah had predicted, when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. And that's where we're going to stop this week. I think we've given you enough to chew on, so study up and have a great class.